Outside the Beltway with John Fredericks. Talking to Americans outside of Washington, in the heartland, in our cities, and in our communities. About what matters to them. Outside the Beltway with John Fredericks starts now.
Jesse Jackson, 1988 convention, Atlanta, Georgia. What a riveting speech. And again, whether you agree with his political ideology or not is irrelevant. He was a transformational figure. He really led to the Obama nomination in 2008, 20 years later. No one ever saw that, but Jackson, like him or not, I mean, he was a great orator, great speaker, had a great story, and moved a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And he won primaries, and he got delegates. And people forget that. I mean, he won Wisconsin. I think he won another state or two, but he had amassed delegates, and he was a serious contender for the nomination on the Democratic side with what he called the Rainbow Coalition. Was kind of the first time we heard of that. So a lot of transformational things that Jesse Jackson did. And, look, was he perfect? No. Who is? But you gotta get back and respect, what he's done. And yeah, there were things he did and et cetera, whatever. But you got to get back and say, wow, this guy had an impact on United States history. No doubt about it. Look, Martin Luther King had his issues, right? We don't want to get into those either, but these men of great courage had an impact on history and many, many others. And R.I.P. Jesse Jackson, R.I.P. Robert Duvall, and hopefully we don't have to do this a lot. It's commemorating our people that we knew and grew up with that are just dying of old age. I don't know the facts of either Jackson's death or of the death of Robert Duvall. I didn't really even know they were sick, but they're gone, and the world will certainly miss them, no doubt about it. 888-480-JOHN, 888-480-5646. Run away, and let's get to Todd Sheets. Todd, before we get to you, I just got to tell you, Jesse Jackson. I remember that speech. I remember where I was in 88, because that was the Atlanta convention. Dukakis was the eventual nominee in that. And Dukakis had an 18-point lead over George H. Bush coming out of that convention in Atlanta. He had put together quite the coalition. And of course, that evaporated, and then he got trounced. I think when he went in the tank was probably the end of him. But Todd Sheets, good to have you with us. Todd, great to have you with us.
Yeah, John, glad to be back with you again.
Just your reaction to Jesse Jackson.
It just, for one, I had forgotten that moment that you mentioned and the Michael Dukakis lead. But the first thing that came to mind when you mentioned it was him in the tank, where it just was this ridiculous shot of like this little guy with a helmet on who looked like he did not belong there. And I think it just made him look small is basically what happened. And then I think the other factor was, that was coming off of the 8 years of the Reagan Revolution and how dramatically that had turned the country around.
Right.
And that kept going. I mean, a lot of people don't understand it, but that was the beginning of what happened in the 90s and during the Clinton years. And so Clinton did some very good things in spite of all of his issues. He didn't waste it with spending. He was fiscally responsible, but he also inherited the economy of a lifetime and the peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. So, given all of that momentum, I'm skeptical that Dukakis was going to ever beat Bush with or without the tank. But yeah, it brings back all of that. And then I think, as you mentioned, Jesse Jackson was a huge figure from the civil rights movement dating back to the 60s. And as we've talked about at times, there's still a lot of change and improvement that needs to happen in this country. But the enormous level of improvement that we've made in civil rights and bringing people of color and minorities into the mainstream of American life over the last 50 years is almost unimaginable. And it's something that all Americans should feel good about, and all Americans should feel committed to continuing that in the right way. And I think, I mean, I'm kind of riffing off on a number of things. One of the other things this brings to mind to me, you mentioned Barack Obama, is Barack Obama used to go around when he was on the campaign trail, and he would dig at the conservatives and the idea of free market economics. And he would say, yeah, they just say pick yourself up by your bootstraps, but what if you don't have any bootstraps? And the thing that has come to me, it didn't at the time, but since then, as I've gotten more into this, was, well, you know what? If you're talking about the poor in America, many of whom live in urban cities, in inner cities, why don't they have bootstraps at this point? Because your policies and your party has been running and controlling those inner cities for the last 50, 60 years now. And one of the great tragedies to me is, to kind of bring this back around, is that even though we've made, I think, enormous strides on racial equality, bringing minorities into the mainstream of American life, letting them participate in the upward mobility that America's always been known for, these great society welfare programs have failed miserably, and they have trapped the poor in systems of dependency and poverty instead of giving them the kind of education and creating the kind of environment where they could have lifted themselves up the way everybody else in America has lifted themselves up. So I think, there are great accomplishments in the civil rights movement on the legal side of things, but there were great tragedies in the failure of those social welfare programs to do the job and supposedly end poverty, which was the promise of them. So yeah, that's all the things that come to mind based on that.
Well, that's quite the riff. And many of us believe that it's those anti-poverty programs that basically sustained a welfare system that actually drove down the ability for people of color, many of them taking advantage of that, which was supposed to be in the short term, to basically choose that as a lifestyle and keep them down. And then the Democrats figured out by doing that and giving them more abilities to get government subsidies or welfare, whatever you want to call it, they were able to keep them on the basically the voting payroll. So the Democrats figured this out, and then they ran out of black people, and now they're going after illegals from other countries to do the same thing. I mean, the playbook's not changed; the people have, and now it's to the detriment of many African Americans in this country and Hispanics that came here legally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, again, those inner cities and many other poverty-stricken areas around the country outside. You could go to, some of the rural South, Kentucky, some of those areas and that kind of thing. I mean, that's just, it's this, tragic example of how these programs don't work. They don't help the people that they're supposed to help. And instead of acknowledging that and saying we were wrong and moving to something that would really help them, they get caught and trapped in these systems of handouts, and then they start expanding it throughout the system. And so, now, I think most people in the country, almost everybody would agree, there's a very small percentage of people, who for various reasons, physical, mental, or whatever, they're not going to be able to participate in the economy as a productive citizen in the normal ways and that kind of thing. And they may need some help. Although this brings to mind another interesting thing. I did a lot of research on Henry Ford at one point in time. And in one of his books, this is before all these social welfare programs existed, he started talking about when they implemented the assembly line and they drove the cost of an automobile, which before had been viewed as a rich man's toy. It cost over $1,000, which at that time was affordable to a very small segment. They, with the improvements from the assembly line and that kind of thing, drove the cost of a car down to like $250, $260, below $300. As they did, demand went crazy. And they were having a hard time finding enough workers to hire. And there are a couple of interesting things when you get to talking about how do you really lift people up out of misery and poverty. One of the things he said, we don't care much whether a man is coming here from Sing Sing, i.e. the prison, or from Harvard. In fact, we don't even ask the question of where they came from. What we do is we make sure they want to work, because a man going to work in the Ford factory is going to work. And so we put them to work and we see if they work hard. And if they do, they have an opportunity to rise up in the system regardless of what their background was. And if they don't, they're out, basically. So that was one thing. That was rehabilitating people with a criminal background. He also talked about, in one part, people with, and the terminology at that time was different, but people that were blind or disabled or had only one hand. And he makes this comment. He says, some people would say we should have a different standard for those people, but we don't. We just find the places where their, what he called disabilities don't impair their ability to get the job done. And then he goes into this story about a blind man who they brought into a certain function that had 3 or 4 people doing it. And he was so good that he could do the work of all 3 of the people who had sight. And so they moved them into another area of the company. Mm-hmm. So, it's also important to keep in mind, in spite of the fact we were talking about helping out, a small number of people, we go down these paths of government needing to do everything, we think. But in reality, in the past, there were ways of helping people that didn't involve government that I think in many ways were much better off for the people. Those people had a job to go to. They were part of a community, a social thing. They were part of a growing company and all that kind of thing. So anyway, all these things are.
We have just destroyed, we have destroyed LBJ's War on Poverty, destroyed an entire generation of people. It was just, look, work ethic and doing the right thing and pulling yourself up is what this country was based on. And, now it's really shifted away from that. Todd Sheets with us. Todd, author of the bestseller, the 2008 Financial Crash, What Really Happened. Also, Todd, riffing here. Todd, let's get the state of the economy. We got an amazing jobs report out, I think, on Thursday after Friday morning. 130,000 jobs, 140,000 jobs created. Economists expected 60,000. So again, Wall Street way off. You almost feel like the Wall Street gurus down there, Todd, are rooting for this economy to fail, rooting for inflation to go up, rooting for jobs to collapse so they can blame it on tariffs and get back to, shipping jobs out for cheap labor or getting people in to work, for peanuts. But what was your take? I know there's people keep saying, oh, there's signs the economy is weakening, but we got GDP at 5%. We got jobs up. We got inflation tamed. What is it that people are complaining about?
Yeah, well, I think you're definitely right about part of that. There are so many people that predicted that the tariffs were going to be such a disaster that they have to keep finding some reason to support the idea that the tariffs were a bad idea, all evidence to the contrary kind of thing. So I think that's one key point. I think on the point of Wall Street missing these forecasts, this just goes back for me why I've spent my life, I was a CPA for a while before I was an investment banker. Both as a CPA and as an investment banker, I probably ran more financial models on apartment properties or companies or whatever than anybody else has ever run. So I have a whole history of doing this. But I have no faith, confidence, or interest in these econometric models that everybody runs around with, acting like they can predict the future with them. Because, as we see with these jobs reports, one, they're predicting, they're not like off by 1 or 2% or 3%, they're off by 100%. and then they're off by 100%. And then a month from now, even the people that created those numbers, they'll go back and adjust them by 40 or 50%. So it's just like you have to look at the trends in the real world and base your understanding of the economy from that.
When I get back, why the tariffs are working, why the economy is taking off, and we haven't even seen the benefits of the one big beautiful bill yet. That's coming. The boom is coming, baby. Todd and I are going to be right back. Elaine Parker too. Keep it right here. 888-480-JOHN.